Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds.
Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Hello, Beat Check listeners. I'm Gosia Wozniacka, and I'm the environmental justice reporter at the Oregonian. Today, I'm with Mike Rogoway, my colleague who covers the business of technology for the Oregonian and OregonLive. Mike has written extensively about Oregon's rapidly growing data center industry and its impacts on our state. And today, we're going to talk specifically about how data centers' massive energy consumption could impact regular power users. In other words, how it could impact our electricity bills, and what legislators are trying to do to protect regular customers like you and I from rising electricity costs. So let's get started. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Yeah, Gosia, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to speak with me. So before we dive into what legislators are doing, let's set the table for our conversation here. Just how much energy are data centers using, and is that amount that use projected to grow?
Yeah, so I think the number from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality suggests it's somewhere around 6.6 million megawatt hours a year, maybe 11% of Oregon's power total. So that works out to more than 600,000 homes, the equivalent of more than 600,000 homes. And you asked if it's going to grow. Yes, it is going to grow. The demand for artificial intelligence is soaring, and that's very, very high energy computing. So forecasters look, and we know that many data centers have, including Amazon, have ambitious construction plans in the Northwest. And so, you know, the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, they say it could be anywhere from doubling by the end of the decade to potentially quadrupling. Industry insiders, people inside the data center industry, say that the Conservation Council's estimates are probably on the low end, and that it's probably at the high end of that range, tripling or quadrupling by 2030.
Wow. And one of the things I read in your recent stories, by 2030, Northwest data centers could consume nearly as much electricity as all the homes in Oregon and Washington today.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it is an enormous footprint that they have, and it's really changing the power landscape in the region. If you look back at power use in Oregon, for example, there really wasn't much change in power use from, say, 2010 to 2019, 2020. What was happening is, you know, even though our economy was growing and getting more digital, it was also getting more efficient. Right. And so, you know, households, industries were using less electricity, even as the market was growing. Well, data centers and artificial intelligence have flipped that. And so now regional energy use is increasing and increasing rapidly.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And when it comes to our bills, you know, obviously people have already seen recent bill increases. Why is the growth of data center energy consumption such a problem for families and individuals who are getting their power bills?
Well, it may not be yet, but it may be in the future. It could be a big issue. Now, we all pay for the electricity we use. You know, if the data center uses some power, then, you know, I'm not charged directly for that. But if the data centers need so much more power that the existing infrastructure can't support it, if there isn't enough generation and transmission, then somebody has to pay. And in a perfect world, even under existing regulations, as I understand them, as the Oregon Public Utility Commission describes them to me, the goal is to assign new costs to customers who are creating those new costs. So if there's new generation built, if there's new transmission to serve, you know, data centers specifically, in a perfect world, you know, that the PUC would say, okay, those costs should be passed on by the electric utilities to those big new customers. Mm-hmm. The problem is, what the PUC says is that Oregon regulations didn't anticipate this much new power demand this quickly. And so the regulations aren't really clear about exactly how to make those allocations. And so some of those costs could end up spilling over to other customers, including people like you and me, residential customers. There's another potential problem, and that's what happens if there's a big spike in demand and then that demand goes away. Right now, we live in a world where data centers will take all the power they can get. Their big constraint in growth is lack of electricity. They want to grow as rapidly as they can. They want to capture as much of the artificial intelligence market as they can for themselves, whether they're Amazon or Facebook or Google or whomever. But it's not totally clear that that growth will continue, that exponential growth will continue indefinitely, or where it will stop. You know, if you're a $1 trillion tech company, as strange as it sounds, you'd rather lose $1 billion by overbuilding than potentially lose out on the AI market permanently because you didn't build enough. So they're willing to take the chance. And so they say, yeah, you know, build that transmission, you know, we need that power, build that new generation, we need that power. But what happens if 5 years from now, they're like, you know what, we didn't need quite as much as we thought. Or maybe artificial intelligence eventually gets more efficient, the same way other kinds of computing has, and its power footprint drops. Well, somebody's still got to pay for that transmission and generation. That could be the customers that are still here. Again, that could fall to you and me. So that's another kind of risk that people are concerned about.
Got it. And going back to what you said earlier, you know, it sounds like this is going to be an issue really going forward. And so I just want to be pretty clear, because we've already had, you know, 40% rate increases over the past few years. Data centers were not a major cause of those, right?
I think your reporting and my reporting suggests that's probably correct. You know, that's not to say there was zero impact, but I think people looking at what's happened to our power rates don't see, you know, and Gosha, you can correct me on this, but my sense is that it's been more about the impact of wildfires, the impact of electrification, all of us getting more electrical in our homes and in transportation and things like that.
Yeah. And
more so than the data centers.
Correct. And I think utilities also had to buy a lot more power on the open market, and that power is very expensive. So that was another major cost that we've all had to bear. And just wanted to clarify that. So we're looking at the future, and as you said, you know, the need for power quadrupling potentially from these data centers, and so there's a need to shield regular customers, you know, families, individuals who have also, you know, much smaller needs for power, obviously. So you've written about a bill in this new legislative session that potentially could help, that Oregon regulators are, you know, they're trying to figure out how to insulate residential customers from the costs associated with supplying energy to data centers. Can you tell us more about this bill?
Yeah, so, and last I checked, and I looked yesterday, it doesn't have a bill number yet. It's still a legislative concept. Yeah. The session is just getting underway now. But the idea is the bill would explicitly say that the PUC, the Oregon PUC, has the authority to insulate residential ratepayers and other ratepayers from the costs incurred with serving large industrial customers. The first draft of the bill said data centers specifically. It used an identification, employment identification code to specifically single out data centers. I'm told that may drop out, that data centers objected to being singled out, and that even the bill's drafters said, well, it's not necessary to single them out. Any new large customer could have the same impact. So the idea is the PUC would have the authority to insulate others and to assign costs incurred by large industrial customers, data centers, and others directly to those large industrial customers. And more than that, it would instruct them to do so. It wouldn't just say this is something you can do. It would say this is something you must do. And as you know, covering rate cases, it's very complicated, and there's ambiguities in the law that that get arbitrated before the PUC and potentially in the courts.
Mm-hmm.
So this would create some clarity, some explicit clarity in the law that says this is how these costs should be borne.
Yeah, because there's some gray areas right now. And so this would be the cost of specifically building new transmission lines or new clean energy projects that mostly serve this data center industry. How would they exactly do this, separate these costs?
Well, the bill is vague on that, and my guess is that that's where the sausage will be made. It gives the PUC, a lot of discretion in how it does it in the broad. I think it's a 2-page bill, but I could well imagine that as things get hashed out through legislative committees and things like that, if the bill does advance, that's the sort of thing that there would be specifics to lay out exactly how they would determine who is responsible for what. And perhaps reduce some more ambiguity. There's one other feature of the bill, though, that I think is worth highlighting. We just mentioned, what happens if some of this power demand evaporates or doesn't materialize. Mm-hmm. And we've already spent the money building new generation and new transmission. Well, the bill would require these large industrial customers to commit to a certain amount of power to a certain amount of time for a certain amount of time.
Got it. So to pay.
Right. So, in theory, I suppose a company could go bankrupt or something like that. But if Amazon or Google and these trillion-dollar companies or nearly trillion-dollar companies come in and say, we want this power, they would be obliged to buy it for a period of time, maybe 10 years or something like that. And so that would reduce the risk of a stranded asset that we all end up picking up the cost of.
Got it. What do the data center operators have to say about this bill or this proposal?
I think in principle, everyone's on board. But again, the devil's in the details, and we'll just have to see how that gets sorted out. I think both parties in Salem, both Democrats and Republicans, are sensitive to rising energy costs, and they're supportive of that. And I think the data centers say we should be responsible for the costs we incur. Amazon's statement on this says, transmission charges fund the ongoing grid modernization and upgrades required to support the needs of all energy users. And I read that, and I think it's intended to be read as a suggestion that data centers should not bear undue costs here. For this, that and it's correct that a more efficient transmission system benefits all of us. We're all going to be using more electricity in the years ahead as we move away from fossil fuels. There'll be fewer gas furnaces in homes. There'll be more electric cars. So household electrification, should bear its own costs according to the logic of how the PUC assigns costs. So I think the data centers say that, we shouldn't be bearing other people's costs, at least on transmission. We should all be sharing that. Well, how you allocate that may turn out to be fairly difficult, and this may be the point of contention as the bill goes before lawmakers in Salem. Is exactly how do we work that out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I do think that's what Amazon is saying. So just as a reminder, we're in the middle of a clean electricity transition. Oregon has to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions associated with electricity by 80% by 2030 and reach 100% emission-free electricity sources by 2040. So we're supposed to do that with all of our electricity. And this isn't even taken into account the new, electricity that we'll need. So we're already transitioning. And then on top of that, we've got to find additional clean energy sources for all the new electricity that data centers or, electric vehicles, heat pumps, et cetera, will need. So in a way, that is correct, that we'll need more electricity overall, not just for the data centers, but for all these other needs that we'll need to build more solar farms and wind farms and transmission lines to get this clean energy to users and replace all the old polluting stuff that we've had. So it's
Yeah, and I think, unlike some industries, technology, the data center industry accepts the science around climate change. They accept the scientific consensus that, human carbon emissions are changing the climate, and that's undesirable. It will create many harmful effects. So the data centers all say, we're on board with that, and they're willing to make the transition. Whether they support Oregon specific policy or not is another matter. And I think, the way that these costs get allocated is going to be part of the complexity in this bill.
Right.
But
they're clearly saying they don't want to pay at all.
No, you're exactly right. That's what they're saying. And so we'll just have to see, how the nuances of the bill get worked out, or, if it survives in something like its current form, how the PUC interprets it.
Right. Well, and then I want to point out the philosophical dilemma here. Why should data centers pay for the cost of their energy if we, all of you, you and I, our listeners, everybody in Oregon, across the U.S. and across the world who uses computers, we're the users, the end users of data centers. We're all using phones, computers, applications, and those are all increasingly relying on AI, artificial intelligence. And so, in a sense, we're using that energy. Not the data centers. The data centers are just kind of transferring it. So, shouldn't we all be responsible for that massive surge in data center demand for electricity, and shouldn't we all pay for it? Isn't that a valid argument?
Yeah, I think, this very podcast is being streamed to people. It's being hosted in the data center somewhere and being streamed, out of those computers. Everything we do online is contributing to rising energy usage and ultimately perhaps rising energy costs. So yeah, we're all bearing a part of this. I think what advocates of this legislation would say, and particularly, I asked this question of Representative Pam Marsh, who's probably going to be the sponsor of this bill. She says that's fine, but the tech companies should be recouping their costs by selling their product. If they're providing artificial intelligence services, they should charge for that service, not making all of us pay for the cost of the electricity to support it. So they bear their own cost of electricity and they pass that on to their customers. It's one step removed from us paying their electric bill, essentially.
Right.
And, if artificial intelligence is a viable product, it should be able to support the cost of not just the technology, but the energy use that enables the technology. And I don't think anyone disagrees with that in principle. It's just a question of how we're going to work that out mechanically. But yes, it is something for all of us to be conscious of when we're using our computers, when we're using data centers, when we're doing queries on artificial intelligence, when we're making a cool graphic image, out of ChatGPT or something like that. Hey, that looks really nifty, and it's neat that the computer can do that. But there is a cost to it.
Yeah.
And some of that cost is energy and potentially the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's easy to blame the data centers, and say that they're the evil thing. But, if we're all using the evil thing or relying on it for our everyday use, then there is kind of a moral dilemma there.
Yeah.
But obviously, these companies are making loads of money as well. So we shouldn't forget that. And so, as you mentioned, it is a product, and folks who are using it should be paying for it. Back to the legislation. So one thing I wanted to point out that is it would apply only to investor-owned utilities. So that's PacifiCorp and PGE, Portland General Electric. But it doesn't apply to cooperatives. Can you talk a little bit about why that is and why that's important in this conversation?
Yeah, the PUC doesn't have the same regulatory oversight of, these member-owned utilities as the investor-owned utilities in Oregon. So they set the rules for how power rates are set, power costs are allocated for PacifiCorp and PGE, but the utilities that serve the data centers include, like the Umatilla Electric Cooperative in Morrow and Umatilla counties. They serve Amazon out there, and they set their own rules. They have a lot more freedom of that. So what protects those residential customers? Well, they have a very powerful protection. They're member owned. If the utility passes on the costs to everyday members instead of a couple big customers, well, the members aren't going to be very happy, and they're going to change the leadership there. They have some direct recourse over the operation of those utilities, and I think we see some evidence of that. The prices that Matilla Electric Cooperative has been paying on average for power have gone up a lot as Amazon has gone there, and they've had to go out into the open market to buy power for Amazon's data centers. But the cost for residential customers hasn't gone up very much. And I think we can see that the cooperative is probably doing that, is they are successfully allocating costs, the higher costs of serving Amazon to Amazon and insulating their residential customers from that.
That's fascinating. It sounds like a good model to follow for.
Well, we can argue about public and private power and which is more efficient and where it's effective. It's an age-old discussion here in the Northwest, as many of our listeners will know. But at least in a small community, like Morrow and Umatilla counties,
seems to be working.
It's protecting the residential customers there. So at least as far as that goes, it seems to be working.
So you're working on another story about Umatilla Electric Cooperative right now, and it's a really fascinating story that ties into this discussion. You've been able to show that Umatilla has reduced its carbon emissions very recently after many years of increases, and it did so by purchasing a lot more hydropower than in the past. At the same time, Umatilla's sales continue to grow thanks to data centers. So, how did Umatilla Cooperative manage to do this? Is this growth sustainable? And is this a reduction in emissions sustainable?
Yeah, well, I'll take you back in time a couple years. We noticed that, as Amazon grew there, that the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality every year issues a report on the carbon emissions associated with the electricity generation of all of the state's utilities. And we noticed a couple years ago that Umatilla Electric, they've got like 16,000 customers. We noticed their carbon emissions were soaring. Up like tenfold in the space of just a few years. They became one of the state's largest polluters. And even though they have just 16,000 customers, they became the state's third largest utility in terms of electricity delivered. That's all because of Amazon and its data centers. And so we're watching this, and we wrote about this in 2022, and then we wrote about it again in 2023, and we saw this, big spike in emissions. At the same time, Amazon was saying, we're committed to getting clean energy. Well, this attracted a lot of attention that, Amazon didn't appear to be walking its talk. They said, well, we generate clean power elsewhere, and, it all comes out in the wash, but a lot of people were skeptical of its claims. Well, in December, the state issued its latest report on Umatilla Electric's emissions. And what we saw was that they were still buying a lot more power, like 20% more, but their emissions were way down. And it's, less than half of what they used the year before. And it spells out, as you say, how they did this. They bought hydropower. They shifted, they're buying power on the open market, to serve Amazon's data centers. And previously they'd been buying, power that came generation primarily from fossil fuels, mostly natural gas. Well, they switched that abruptly in 2023, and it resulted in a great decrease in their emissions. Most of it comes from Bonneville. Some of it comes from other Northwest hydro producers. The trick is that there's no new hydro being built in the Northwest. Yeah. Nobody's building another dam on the Columbia at this point. Those days are past. And so when Umatilla starts outbidding others for hydropower, that means other people don't have access to that hydropower. That means, less renewable energy, or at least renewable available to others, or at least it'll be at higher prices. So this is a two-edged sword. Is this good or bad? Well, it is potentially squeezing out other customers who might want renewable energy. On the other hand, if you're an energy company looking to invest your capital, and you see that there's huge demand in Oregon for renewable energy from large tech companies who have a lot of money and are clearly willing to pay a premium for it, you might say, well, maybe I will invest in some transmission lines. Maybe I'll invest in renewable power in the Northwest because I can see there's a demand for it. I can see that people will pay. So it's a dynamic situation, but at the very least, there appears to be a commitment to move to more renewable energy. We talked about investors doing it. Amazon has been talking for a few years about various ways it might build its own power supply, and one thing they're talking about are nuclear power plants in Richland. That's just Richland, Washington. That's just 60 miles from its data centers around Boardman and Hermiston. So Amazon may be putting its own money where its mouth is too. Of course, nuclear power has its own environmental costs, but it doesn't particularly contribute to carbon emissions and climate change.
Right. Well, and it's no surprise that some of our state's largest solar projects are locating in that region. 10,000-acre solar farm recently approved by the state is in eastern Oregon. So, they may be helpful in providing some of that power. But, sort of bringing it back to our discussion about shielding customers, obviously that hydropower was pretty expensive. Umatilla Cooperative had to probably outbid a few others to get more of that hydropower than it had in the past. And yet, it seems like its residential customers were at least, to date, shielded from those costs. So that's an interesting sort of dynamic there.
The trick is that perhaps Umatilla Electric is shielding its own customers, but perhaps some of those costs are going to spill over to other electric customers in Oregon. It's the complexity of the power market. We don't know that that's happening yet, but it could happen. It could happen if we all want renewable power, and renewable power is at a premium. So it's a really complex dynamic, and it's something that we're going to be watching closely because the power landscape in Oregon is changing very, very, very rapidly, in large part because of data centers.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Mike. This is a fascinating conversation. I'll post some of your stories alongside the online post so folks can read, and we'll be following this topic in future stories in the Oregonian and online at OregonLive. Thank you so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcast. It helps people find the show, helps spread the word. The best way to support our journalism, of course, is with a subscription to OregonLive, and you can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time, thank you.